Greeting, stranger. Glad to be back on dry land at last, eh? Me too, though, admittedly, I would prefer to leave this town as quickly as possible. We will be departing at the break of day tomorrow, and heading north onto Darkmoon Plain. This evening, though, with my business in Oregent concluded, I thought I would take the time to consult our faithful companion the Encyclopaedia Galarianensis once more to see us through the long hours. Tonight I would tell you about a family of creatures that punches above its considerable weight in fame and notoriety, despite comprising fundamentally simple entities. I refer to the beings collectively called the cave worms, not regular worms that you happen to find in caves sometimes, but rather the gargantuan engines of destruction that slither and chew their way through hundreds of miles of Darklands rock. You have doubtless heard of the most common species within this family, the dreaded purple worm, but you may not be aware that our amethyst-coloured friends account for one of at least half a dozen distinct breeds, most of whose strengths are even more formidable than the purple worms. So, pour yourself a drink, and settle in for my exposition on Galarian's most feared magical annelids. The titanic monsters known as cave worms superficially resemble the harmless earthworms often encountered in people's gardens. Like their tiny polyphyletic brethren, cave worms' bodies are segmented, though their backs are covered in nigh impenetrable armoured plates. Their instincts are straightforward, though theirs involve consuming all living beings they can find. And they pass most of their adult lives chewing through the earth, though the earth beneath Galarian's surface is mostly solid rock, which poses no hindrance to cave worms' staggeringly powerful jaws. Unlike the common earthworm, however, cave worms are not blind, and indeed have excellent dark vision in addition to their tremor sense. Their front and back ends are readily distinguished by the venomous stingers usually found on the latter, and most notably, cave worms can grow to over 100 feet long. To the uninitiated adventurer, it can appear as though an encounter with a cave worm can be readily avoided. Knowing only of their immense size gives the impression that their presence will be detected long before they breach the Darklands tunnels frequented by intrepid explorers. Yet in reality, it can be difficult to detect an approaching cave worm until it is far too late, because although they are very long, they are seldom more than 5 feet wide. This means that they do not excavate as much rock as their mass suggests, and once they have detected their prey, they can, on instinct, slow their pace of burrowing. Undoubtedly, the sound of cave worm teeth gnawing off hunks of rock is detectable, but is it identifiable through dozens of feet of untouched, solid stone? My advice is not ever to learn the answer to that question with a practical experiment. Now, while all cave worm species have distinct ecologies owing to environmental variations, it remains true that you will never encounter one above ground or in a so-called shallow cave system that is close to the surface. All cave worms on the material plane are subterranean creatures, encountered only in the Darklands, or at least at that level of depth. You will know when you are in one's territory by the sudden appearance of tube-like passages riddling the rock like eyes in cheese. To the untrained explorer, these will seem random and haphazard at first, but a careful exploration will reveal that they all lead back to a central, natural cavern, the cave worm nest. Within, one will discover the fruits of the worm's labour, often literally, for all cave worms start life small. More compellingly, though, one will also find therein an abundance of equipment, gemstones, and unrefined yet compacted ores, regurgitated by the worm after resisting its stomach's highly corrosive acid. Some scholars believe that cave worms have evolved an instinctive compulsion to regurgitate in their own nests to lure intelligent beings there for easier hunting. I am not sure how true this is. Cave worms are remarkably stupid animals, but it nevertheless remains true that finding oneself in a cave worm's lair unprepared typically heralds an unfortunate death. The fascination most sapient beings have for cave worms has led to a remarkably advanced understanding of their biologies. For example, we know that many of the metals and gemstones consumed by a cave worm are reprocessed over time into the carapace-like plates along its back. In a similar vein, no pun intended of course, The toxic elements found beneath the earth are consumed with indifference and find themselves adapted into the deadly slurry excreted as caveworm venom through their stingers. We also know that caveworms are not totally mindless, which is actually a rather happy revelation, for this means they can be tamed, trained, and manipulated, be it with magic or an incredibly brave, or stubborn, animal handler. There will doubtless be no end to the supply of plucky adventurers claiming that they will be the one to ride a caveworm into glorious battle, something that one imagines suits the caveworms just fine. Caveworms can live for thousands of years, though most die in their first century. They mature incredibly slowly, gaining mass and size within a protective egg laid by an adult over a millennium. However, the odds of an egg being disturbed, particularly by an adult worm, are rather high, and to compensate for this vulnerability, the eggs contain an emergency reserve slurry of nutrients that is released all at once if handled too roughly. This food flood allows an unhatched caveworm to grow in a mere fraction of the normal time. The reason this is held as an emergency option, though, is because it is extremely disruptive to a caveworm's biology, and the odds of survival are slim. It is not unlike throwing a child into a river to teach them how important water is to their survival. Caveworm eggs are laid in the thousands, but normally only a few hundred worms ever hatch. Once free of their eggs, juvenile worms grow at an alarming rate, instinctively seeking out living tissue to consume in repulsive swarms called broods. Juvenile worms are carnivorous, as their mouths have not yet become strong enough to digest minerals and nutrients from rock. They will not begrudge consuming each other either, should their brood fail to stumble upon sufficient biomass to sustain it. The most recognizable and alarming trait, common to all caveworms, is the rapidity with which they recover from anything that would slow their advance. Caveworms are inexorable. They cannot be immobilized, their advance cannot be hindered for more than a few seconds. Their bodies shrug off paralytics that would incapacitate other creatures of comparable size, and they seem able to repel even magical tethers with ease. For creatures that are ostensibly not magical themselves, this is a remarkable quality. Now, let us discuss the individual species of the caveworm family. Purple worms are, of course, the best-known member. These horrors are adepts when it comes to waylaying adventurers, perhaps more so than their rarer, more powerful cousins. Being the most common species of caveworm, purple worms' lavender to indigo-coloured hides inspire fear in plenty of Darklands denizens. Purple worms are even more ravenous than their kin, and tend to seek out living beings more frequently as a consequence. Purple worm venom acts as a potent suppressant, weakening the body whilst delivering enough toxins to slay an average humanoid in under 6 seconds. Alchemists prize this liquid. A single sample of the venom is worth 500 gold, but harvesting it always proves difficult. Purple worms are the holotype species. They may be the default, yet they remain, in absolute terms, the deadliest. A slightly weaker and much less commonly encountered species of caveworm is the grey worm. Grey worms seem to inhabit, and probably mature within, areas of the Darklands infused with necromantic or void energy. Researchers on this elusive species hypothesize that their presence in an area might indicate an ancient population center before Earthfall wiped out millions and began the Age of Darkness. Whatever the truth may be, it remains undeniable that grey worms have adapted to their environment most unsettlingly. Despite being living creatures, they are harmed by the light of creation's forge, which sustains almost all other life, and instead draw power from the void as though they were undead. Furthermore, grey worms' diets consist entirely of dead flesh, and to help facilitate this, they can sense blood within a mile of open air, or 1,000 feet of rock. This latter sensitivity, some assume, must be magical in nature, and so for these reasons, grey worms are not considered animals, but rather beasts. Their venom is an occult paralytic that affects only the living, and this should be a clue that despite their restrictive dietary requirements, grey worms have no qualms about hunting adventurers to preserve for a later meal. The so-called Azure Worms are considered existential threats even to native Darklanders, for their deep blue bodies seldom leave the underground lakes and flooded tunnels that they call home. Alas, this does not mean that Azure Worms do not move from their lairs. It rather means that anything they carve out whilst hunting tends to flood behind them in short order, and this environmental damage can be even more dangerous than the worm itself. That said, while considerably less common than purple worms, Azure Worms are, by all accounts, the hardier species. Their venom is not immediately as lethal as the purple worms, but it rather leaves victims clumsy and uncoordinated. On land, that might be preferable to instant death, but in the lightless water, it entails horrific drowning. Given the dangers of caveworm venom, it is natural to assume that the one species of caveworm lacking venom would number among the easiest to confront. I am afraid to report, however, that nothing could be farther from the truth. In the depths of the glacial north dwell the Glacial Worms, monsters so cold that their very presence is sufficient to leach heat from the surrounding air like a vacuum. Indeed, Glacial Worms draw strength from ice and extreme cold so readily that it is almost impossible to slay one in their chosen territory. To make matters even worse, their carapaces are stronger even than Azure Worms, making them the second most powerful species of caveworm on Galarian. The most powerful species is, without a doubt, the almighty Crimson Worm. These lava-dwelling horrors combine all the rugged constitution of the Glacial Worms, swapping a love of the cold for a love of heat, naturally, along with the venomous cunning of the purple worms. Crimson worms are luckily very rarely encountered, even in their native volcanic regions, but when they are, it is usually only once. A crimson worm is, like a grey worm, considered a beast rather than an animal. In the case of the crimson worm, this is because it seems to demonstrate a preternatural affiliation with the elemental plane of fire, leading scholars to believe that they choose their homes based not on heat alone, but specifically on connections between that blasted plane and the material. Moreover, crimson worm venom is not particularly toxic, but instead attacks the very constitution of the victim, draining them of their essence more effectively than any natural venom. As if all this were not enough, crimson worms can, uniquely, exhale a cone of elemental fire before them, dousing everything in cleansing flames. The one saving grace of fighting such a fearsome foe is that, as a being connected to fire, it is naturally quite weak to cold, just as the glacial worm is weak to heat. Be sure to bring plenty of bespelled weaponry, or mages capable of delivering blasts of ice from safe distances. There does exist one final breed of caveworm. At least one final breed is known to the Encyclopaedia Galarianensis, which itself acknowledges but does not discuss the so-called great worms of legend. This final entry pertains to the so-called shadow worms, which dwell on the plane of shadow, secluded from most mortal knowledge and sight. They resemble crimson worms in many respects, boasting of similar abilities, only centered around their affinity with darkness instead of fire. It is important to note, though, that shadow worms are considered animals and not beasts, meaning that the plane of shadow is indeed capable of producing natural creatures with power comparable to the pinnacle of achievement attainable even to a professional adventurer. The Velstrax that dwell on the plane of shadow have long desired to tame these creatures, which so frequently bring ruin and death to their own communities, but so far they have enjoyed almost no success. A tamed shadow worm, brought low by the Velstrax' fell magics, is known as a midnight worm, but even I know little about them. Apparently, only 2 exist. I have met neither, and I pray that I never will. Well, stranger, those are the cave worms. Together, they form a pretty cohort of colourful creatures, at least when confined to the pages of a bestiary. In reality, each inhabits its own ecological niche, and, being quite territorial in adulthood, encountering more than one at a time is almost impossible to arrange naturally. I, for one, have seen my fair share of cave worms throughout my Darklands travels, And let me share with you that the prettiest colour in the world remains monochromatic without a source of light to illuminate it. Consequently, it is quite hard to tell which breed of cave worm you are fighting with dark vision alone, yet bringing a torch underground is practically an open invitation to the locals that you are an outsider. A dangerous gamble. Something to keep in mind for your next Darklands adventure. Well, I will retire for the night. We have an early start tomorrow, remember? We will both need clear heads if we are to navigate Darkmoon Plain safely. In the morning we depart for Falcon's Hollow. Well, until then.